August 7th, 1943. North Atlantic, a patch of black ocean southwest of Bermuda that German charts simply called Operations Gebiet. The sea was almost gentle, a low swell rolling under the steel hull of U-84, a Type 7B boat that had prowled these waters since 1941. On 15 previous patrols, she had hunted in wolf packs called Grönland, Raubritter, Endras grim poetry, for men who lived for weeks in diesel fumes and sweat. Now, on her 17th patrol, under Kapitänleutnant Horst Uphoff, she was doing what German submarines had done almost every night of the war, surfacing. The ritual was as old as the U-boat arm itself. First, the low thump as ballast tanks blew and the boat rose, bow first, toward the faint silver line of the surface. Then an abrupt lurch as she broke through, water cascading off the casing in sheets. Hatches banged open. Stale, oily air belched upward, replaced by cold Atlantic wind that stung eyes and cleared throats. Men clambered out carrying binoculars and machine guns, coughing, spitting, grinning just to feel open air. Batteries were low, carbon dioxide levels were high. Inside, the air was sour enough to taste. Surfacing was not a luxury, it was survival. Diesels roared to life, twin Germania-Werft engines turning 2 bronze screws and sending a deep vibration through steel and bone alike. At 15 knots on the surface, U-84 could outrun almost anything underwater, and in 1941, most things in the air, especially at night. Lookouts took their places, one forward, one aft, one on either beam, eyes sweeping for blacker shapes against the black horizon. They were trained to notice the hunched silhouettes of merchantmen, the dim cut of a destroyer's bow wave, the thin phosphorescent line of a torpedo wake. Aircraft, in U-boat doctrine, were a daytime threat. At night, the sky was their ally. Below, Uphoff and his officers stood in the red-lit control room, the cramped nerve center of the boat. Gauges flickered, needles trembled. Batteries would need hours of charging. The radio officer prepared to raise the short whip aerial and tap out a contact report back to Admiral Dönitz's headquarters. Somewhere, on this vast, indifferent ocean, there were convoys. Somewhere, other U-boats listened, waiting for his signal. No one on U-84 could hear the invisible search beam sweeping silently through the dark, 5,000 feet above them. A United States Navy PB-4Y-1 Liberator, aircraft B-4 of Squadron V B-105, was on anti-submarine patrol that night, part of a long-range barrier thrown across western Atlantic shipping lanes. It looked like an ordinary 4-engined bomber in navy blue, but in its belly, it carried equipment that had only recently tipped the balance of the Atlantic War. A centimetric radar set scanned the sea with 10-centimeter waves that German Metox receivers could not detect. On Liberator's scope, a bright pip bloomed against the background noise, small, moving, unmistakably artificial. The radar operator called out a bearing and range. In the dim cockpit, the pilot banked the big bomber, throttling back to keep from overshooting the contact. They had rehearsed this in endless training flights over Cape Cod and the Chesapeake. Find the pip, home in on it, hold your altitude, do not lose the contact in sea clutter. The flight engineer glanced down at the arming panel for the new weapon slung beneath the bomb bay, a stubby, cigar-shaped cylinder with tail fins and a round nose that looked oddly blunt for a torpedo. The Mark 24 mine, codenamed Fido, was the Navy's secret. On paper, it was a mine so that, if anyone heard of it, they would imagine a static explosive sitting on the seabed, not a battery-powered acoustic homing torpedo, the first of its kind, built to hunt submarines the way submarines hunted ships. In the control room of U-84, the radio man had just started tapping out a routine signal, the metal key clicking under his fingers, when the forward lookout screamed. The Liberator came out of the night as a darker shadow against low cloud, a brief silhouette of 4 engines and a high tail. Someone on the bridge shouted, "Flugzeug!" Someone else yelled, "Alarm!" The klaxon brayed its rising, desperate wail as men dove for the hatch. On the bridge, the officer of the watch snatched up the voice tube to the control room. Crash dive, schnell, schnell. U-84's bow plunged as valves slammed open, and cold water flooded the ballast tanks. Diesel engines choked and stopped. Electric motors hummed to life. The boat's nose angled down, loose gear slid forward. Men braced themselves against bulkheads polished by countless hands. This drill had saved dozens of U-boats. See the plane, dive, disappear. On the Liberator, the pilot shoved the yoke forward and dropped toward the foaming wake, where the U-boat had been seconds before. On the radar screen, the contact winked out as the steel hull slipped under, but they no longer needed radar. They needed timing and nerve. Mark, 24 away. The torpedo fell from its shackles with a heavy lurch the crew felt more than heard, the Bombay momentarily lighter. A curl of smoke trailed from its tail as a small parachute blossomed, slowing its fall. It hit the sea with a smack that vanished into the night. Inside the weapon, blunt engineering elegance came to life. The parachute tore free. A bellows and pendulum system settled it to a preset depth. 4 hydrophones set around its midsection began to listen, tiny underwater ears tuned for the rhythm of propellers. Its electric motor spun up with a whining growl and drove a single propeller at about 12 knots, just fast enough to outrun any submerged U-boat. Below, U-84 leveled off. The depth gauge needle swept down past 30 meters, then 40, then 50. Men watched it with the wary respect of those who knew exactly how much pressure steel could take. They waited for the first volley of conventional depth charges, the familiar drumbeat of a surface attack, a pattern of thunder that grew louder and then faded. Instead, there was only the whine of their own electric motors and the sound of their breathing. Then, faintly, something else. Technicians who later studied the weapon described Fido's sound as a steady whir, like a distant saw in the next room. To submarine ears straining in the silence, it must have sounded like an insect somewhere in the hull, persistent, directional, wrong. It grew louder. Months earlier, in laboratories at Harvard, in Boston, and in company shops in New Jersey, engineers had proven that the torpedo's crude electronic brain could tell left from right, ahead from astern, comparing the volume in its hydrophones and steering toward the louder of 2 propeller noises. Now, in a patch of Atlantic, dark, far from any shore, that theory became lethal fact. The war diary of U-84 ends without commentary on that night. There are no survivor accounts, no last letters from men describing a strange sound in the deep. According to United States Navy records and post-war German research, the boat simply vanished beneath the wavetops after a single heavy explosion cracked her pressure hull. All 46 men aboard died where they had lived, in the dark, surrounded by steel and water. The Liberator circled the spot, wings banking against the stars. In the dim light from the moon, the crew saw a spreading patch of oil, some floating debris. They marked the position, took bearings, and flew on. Later, the patrol report recorded the event in a few clipped phrases. Probable U-boat sunk by Mark 24 mine. On paper it was just one more line in a daily summary of sightings and sinkings. But for the U-boat arm, that invisible encounter marked something new. A diver's instinct had been overturned. A submarine had dived to escape an aircraft and found that the ocean itself had become transparent to a secret weapon from the sky. By dawn on the 8th of August, 1943, the North Atlantic was as empty as it had ever been, an indifferent sea rolling over the coordinates where U-84 had vanished. No survivors, no signal, not even a drifting lifeboat. For the men of Patrol Squadron 105, it was a success recorded in a few words and a single number. For the German U-boat arm, it was a silence that spoke of something terrifyingly new. In the months that followed, rumours filtered through the surviving crews at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Boats were diving and not coming back. Commanders swore they had followed procedure, gone deep, turned hard, changed course, run silent, yet something found them anyway. It came from nowhere, moved without sonar echo, and struck with surgical precision. Sailors began calling it das singende Gespenst, the singing ghost. What they did not know was that the ghost had a name, Mark 24. At the United States Navy's test ranges near New London, Connecticut, engineers from Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory analyzed every engagement report. Each sinking confirmed that the acoustic homing torpedo had crossed from theory to weapon. The Fido could track a submarine at ranges up to 400 yards, turn in tight circles, and reacquire its target after a miss. It did not need depth settings or pattern drops. It simply listened and followed. The technology had emerged from desperation. In 1942, Allied losses to U-boats had reached catastrophic levels, one ship every 6 hours. The radar and lee light had turned the tide in coastal waters, but in the mid-Atlantic gap, the submarines still ruled. That changed with centimetric radar and the new torpedo. In secret memoranda to Admiral Ernest King, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance called it a decisive development in anti-submarine warfare. By September, the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command had received its first Fidos under Lend-Lease. The British referred to them with the same euphemism, air-laid mines. Crews were trained under oath of secrecy. Instructors told them, "You will not discuss the weapon in mess, in letters, or even among yourselves." Every Fido dropped was logged under the fiction of mine, Type 24, its true nature hidden even from operational summaries. Meanwhile, in occupied France, Admiral Dönitz faced a riddle. The reports from the Atlantic had become eerily similar. No depth-charge detonations, no prolonged attacks, only a single explosion and nothing more. In November, U-59, under Kapitänleutnant Helmut Friedrich Witte, sent a fragmentary message. Aircraft sighted, diving, explosion astern. The signal cut mid-sentence. Witte's boat was never seen again. German scientists at the Torpedoversuchsanstalt Eckernförde were ordered to investigate. They suspected magnetic influence mines or new depth-charge fuses. The idea of a self-guiding torpedo was dismissed as science fiction. Their acoustic decoy, codenamed Bold, produced bubbles to confuse sonar, not sound-seeking weapons. It was useless against Fido, which hunted noise, not echoes. By winter, the effect was unmistakable. The U-boat arm was dying faster than it could be rebuilt. Between August and December 1943, the Allies dropped 204 Fidos. 57 confirmed sinkings followed an astonishing ratio for anti-submarine warfare. The average attack lasted less than 5 minutes. Crews, who once joked that the Atlantic is large, the enemy small, now spoke of the sky as death itself. From captured diaries after the war, historians pieced together the psychological toll. A machinist from U-228 wrote, "We no longer fear the destroyer's depth charges. They are honest explosions, you hear them and they are gone. What terrifies us now is the humming sound that grows and grows until the world ends." The acoustic torpedo forced a radical shift in German tactics. Dönitz ordered boats to remain submerged even when batteries were low, to surface only briefly for air at night, and to run engines at varying speeds to mask their propeller signature. It was futile. Fido listened for patterns, not tones. Even slow turns and variable speed could not deceive its primitive but relentless logic. At Lockheed's Burbank factory, the same production lines that built the P-38 Lightning now supplied the Navy's patrol aircraft. Each Liberator carried a small stencil on its bomb bay door, "1 Fido, handle with care." The weapon cost $15,000, as much as a house in San Diego, but commanders calculated that each saved ship or destroyed submarine was worth millions. By early 1944, Allied scientists had refined the torpedo further, fitting it with a stronger motor and better hydrophones. The Navy's after-action reports read like autopsies. Weapon entered water at 02:20 hours. Detonation at 02:25. Oil and debris observed, no survivors. The precision was clinical. Detached, yet beneath it, lay the quiet revolution of modern warfare. Machines, hunting machines. The German response came too late. Experiments with the Pillenwerfer acoustic countermeasure, a canister that released a stream of bubbles to simulate propeller noise, began in spring 1944. In trials, it deceived the Fido for mere seconds. The torpedo would circle the decoy, lose interest, and return to the real target. Submarine crews called the device the aspirin because it sometimes postponed the inevitable but never cured the disease. In April 1944, U-59's loss was officially recorded as unknown cause. In fact, it had been sunk east of the Azores by a British Sunderland flying boat using a Mark 24. The crew's last transmission was a single word: Verfolgt pursued. That year marked the end of the U-boat's dominance. Fewer and fewer German submarines even reached the mid-Atlantic. Convoy sinkings dropped by 80%. Allied merchantmen began sailing in daylight again. In his post-war memoirs, Admiral Dönitz wrote bitterly, "Our defeat at sea was not by men, but by machines guided by men." Yet for those who flew the long blue patrols, the secret remained. The crews of VB-105, the same squadron that had sunk U-84, received no public recognition until years later. Their reports were locked away under restricted anti-submarine warfare intelligence. When the files were finally declassified in 1957, historians reading them for the first time realized what had happened that August night, the birth of the modern precision weapon. U-84's wreck lies somewhere under 2 miles of water, its pressure hull folded by the weight of the ocean. No plaque marks the spot. But above it, unseen, a new age had begun, one in which silence could no longer save those who fought beneath the waves. By dawn on the 8th of August, 1943, the North Atlantic was as empty as it had ever been, an indifferent sea rolling over the coordinates where U-84 had vanished. No survivors, no signal, not even a drifting lifeboat. For the men of Patrol Squadron 105, it was a success recorded in a few words and a single number. For the German U-boat arm, it was a silence that spoke of something terrifyingly new. In the months that followed, rumours filtered through the surviving crews at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. Boats were diving and not coming back. Commanders swore they had followed procedure, gone deep, turned hard, changed course, run silent, yet something found them anyway. It came from nowhere, moved without sonar echo, and struck with surgical precision. Sailors began calling it das singende Gespenst, the singing ghost. What they did not know was that the ghost had a name, Mark 24. At the United States Navy's test ranges near New London, Connecticut, engineers from Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory analyzed every engagement report. Each sinking confirmed that the acoustic homing torpedo had crossed from theory to weapon. The Fido could track a submarine at ranges up to 400 yards, turn in tight circles, and reacquire its target after a miss. It did not need depth settings or pattern drops. It simply listened and followed. The technology had emerged from desperation. In 1942, Allied losses to U-boats had reached catastrophic levels, one ship every 6 hours. The radar and lee light had turned the tide in coastal waters, but in the mid-Atlantic gap, the submarines still ruled. That changed with centimetric radar and the new torpedo. In secret memoranda to Admiral Ernest King, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance called it a decisive development in anti-submarine warfare. By September, the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command had received its first Fidos under Lend-Lease. The British referred to them with the same euphemism, air-laid mines. Crews were trained under oath of secrecy. Instructors told them, "You will not discuss the weapon in mess, in letters, or even among yourselves." Every Fido dropped was logged under the fiction of mine, Type 24, its true nature hidden even from operational summaries. Meanwhile, in occupied France, Admiral Dönitz faced a riddle. The reports from the Atlantic had become eerily similar. No depth-charge detonations, no prolonged attacks, only a single explosion and nothing more. In November, U-59, under Kapitänleutnant Helmut Friedrich Witte, sent a fragmentary message. Aircraft sighted, diving, explosion astern. The signal cut mid-sentence. Witte's boat. was never seen again. German scientists at the Torpedoversuchsanstalt Eckernförde were ordered to investigate. They suspected magnetic influence mines or new depth-charge fuses. The idea of a self-guiding torpedo was dismissed as science fiction. Their acoustic decoy, codenamed Bold, produced bubbles to confuse sonar, not sound-seeking weapons. It was useless against Fido, which hunted noise, not echoes. By winter, the effect was unmistakable. The U-boat arm was dying faster than it could be rebuilt. Between August and December 1943, the Allies dropped 204 Fidos. 57 confirmed sinkings followed an astonishing ratio for anti-submarine warfare. The average attack lasted less than 5 minutes. Crews who once joked that the Atlantic is large, the enemy small, now spoke of the sky as death itself. From captured diaries after the war, historians pieced together the psychological toll. A machinist from U-228 wrote, "We no longer fear the destroyer's depth charges. They are honest explosions, you hear them and they are gone. What terrifies us now is the humming sound that grows and grows until the world ends." The acoustic torpedo forced a radical shift in German tactics. Dönitz ordered boats to remain submerged even when batteries were low, to surface only briefly for air at night, and to run engines at varying speeds to mask their propeller signature. It was futile. Fido listened for patterns, not tones. Even slow turns and variable speed could not deceive its primitive but relentless logic. At Lockheed's Burbank factory, the same production lines that built the P-38 Lightning now supplied the Navy's patrol aircraft. Each Liberator carried a small stencil on its bomb bay door. 1 Fido, handle with care. The weapon cost $15,000, as much as a house in San Diego, but commanders calculated that each saved ship or destroyed submarine was worth millions. By early 1944, Allied scientists had refined the torpedo further, fitting it with a stronger motor and better hydrophones. The Navy's after-action reports read like autopsies. Weapon entered water at 02:20 hours. Detonation at 02:25. Oil and debris observed. No survivors. The precision was clinical, detached, yet beneath it lay the quiet revolution of modern warfare. Machines hunting machines. The German response came too late. Experiments with the Pillenwerfer acoustic countermeasure, a canister that released a stream of bubbles to simulate propeller noise, began in spring 1944. In trials, it deceived the Fido for mere seconds. The torpedo would circle the decoy, lose interest, and return to the real target. Submarine crews called the device the aspirin because it sometimes postponed the inevitable but never cured the disease. In April 1944, U-59's loss was officially recorded as unknown cause. In fact, it had been sunk east of the Azores by a British Sunderland flying boat using a Mark 24. The crew's last transmission was a single word: Verfolgt, pursued. That year marked the end of the U-boat's dominance. Fewer and fewer German submarines even reached the mid-Atlantic. Convoy sinkings dropped by 80%. Allied merchantmen began sailing in daylight again. In his post-war memoirs, Admiral Dönitz wrote bitterly, "Our defeat at sea was not by men, but by machines guided by men." Yet for those who flew the long blue patrols, the secret remained. The crews of VB-105, the same squadron that had sunk U-84, received no public recognition until years later. Their reports were locked away under restricted anti-submarine warfare intelligence. When the files were finally declassified in 1957, historians reading them for the first time realized what had happened that August night. The birth of the modern, precision weapon. U-84's wreck lies somewhere under 2 miles of water, its pressure hull folded by the weight of the ocean. No plaque marks the spot, but above it, unseen, a new age had begun, one in which silence could no longer save those who fought beneath the waves. Before the summer of 1943, the night belonged to the hunters. German submarines ruled the sea's surface after dark, gliding unseen through moonlight, striking convoys, and vanishing before dawn. To their crews, surfacing was freedom, a time to breathe, smoke, and feel human again after long hours sealed in the metallic tomb below. The Atlantic was vast, and the odds, they believed, were with them. From 1940 to early 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz's strategy of wolf-pack attacks had nearly strangled Britain's lifeline. Submarines patrolled in coordinated groups, each one shadowing convoys by radio and calling in others for massed assaults. British sailors called it the night of the long torpedoes. The results were devastating. Entire convoys burned from bow to stern, lifeboats scattered across the swells. In March of 1943 alone, more than 600,000 tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom. To the men of the U-boat arm, this seemed proof that Germany had found its decisive weapon. The design of the Type 7 boat, the workhorse of the Atlantic campaign, reflected that early confidence. It was not, in truth, a submarine in the modern sense. It was a submersible torpedo boat, built to fight on the surface and dive only when threatened. At full power, it could make 17 knots above water, but barely 7 submerged. Its batteries could last for only a few hours at slow speed. Everything about it assumed that safety lay on the surface and danger below. That doctrine worked until the sky turned against them. In 1941, British Coastal Command began experimenting with primitive radar that could detect a submarine on the surface. These early air-to-surface vessel sets operated on long wavelengths, roughly 1.5 meters. They were clumsy and heavy, but they gave aircraft eyes at night. Soon after, German technicians developed a radar warning receiver called Metox, a wooden box with a cross-shaped antenna that picked up those long waves. Whenever an aircraft turned its radar on, the Metox would squeal in the U-boat's control room, giving several minutes of warning to dive. The duel of detection and evasion began. By 1942, the system felt almost comfortable. U-boats could surface at dusk, run their diesels all night, and dive at dawn if the Metox began to shriek. Crews believed that nothing could find them once they slipped beneath the waves. The ocean was their armor. The war at sea became a deadly rhythm. Merchant convoys left Halifax and New York under escort, following long routes across the Atlantic. U-boats waited like wolves at a pass, listening for propellers through their hydrophones. When they found a target, they surfaced, raced into position, and fired from close range, often within 1,000 yards. The explosions were colossal. A single torpedo could lift a ship's bow clear of the water. Survivors described the sound of metal tearing as if the sea itself were splitting open. The Allies struggled to respond. Their short-range aircraft Hudsons, Sunderlands, Catalinas could protect convoys only near the coasts. In the mid-ocean air gap, there were no patrols. There, the wolves fed freely. For the men inside those grey steel tubes, it was a strange mixture of fear and exultation. U-boat life was brutal. Months without sunlight, damp clothes, foul air, and constant danger. Yet for young sailors, many barely 20, the war offered a sense of purpose and brotherhood. They called themselves Sea Teufel Sea Devils. They sang songs of victory on gramophones between attacks, confident that no enemy could match their skill or courage. In the messes and briefing rooms of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, officers quoted Admiral Dönitz's words, "The submarine is the ultimate weapon of endurance, the invisible hunter of the seas." But endurance alone would not win a technological war. Unbeknown to them, in secret laboratories in Britain and the United States, scientists were forging weapons that would turn the ocean itself against its predators. The centimetric radar, born from the British cavity magnetron, could pierce darkness and cloud alike with 10-centimeter waves. Unlike the older long-wave sets, its signals were invisible to Metox. U-boat lookouts saw only the night until searchlights and bombs erupted above them. When the first centimetric radar-equipped aircraft appeared over the Bay of Biscay in early 1943, the effect was catastrophic. German crews could no longer detect their hunters. They surfaced at night as always and died within minutes. The sky, and once an ally, had become a trap. By spring, the losses were impossible to ignore. Convoys once devastated by wolf packs began crossing the Atlantic almost untouched. The hunter had become the hunted. Dönitz's staff at Kerneval received frantic reports from flotillas, submarines failing to return, patrols ending in silence. In one dreadful month, May of 1943, 41 U-boats were destroyed. German naval officers called it Schwarzer Mai, Black May. The morale of the crews began to fracture. Men whispered of new Allied tricks, invisible radar, death rays, magnetic storms. They did not yet know about Fido, the acoustic torpedo that listened for propellers, but they felt its consequence. Submarines that had dived cleanly beneath an air attack now failed to surface again. In the cramped quarters of their boats, sailors spoke of invisible pursuers. Some captains changed depth erratically, or ordered engines stopped entirely, trying to outwit a weapon they could neither see nor understand. Others prayed to remain undetected altogether. But the equations of physics and industry had already decided their fate. While German yards produced submarines one at a time, American factories were turning out patrol bombers and escort carriers by the hundreds. Liberty ships replaced losses faster than U-boats could sink them. Radar, sonar, and cryptography had merged into a single seamless intelligence network. The ocean that had once seemed endless now felt small, fenced in by invisible lines of radio and radar. By late 1943, surfacing once the moment of relief after hours of suffocating air had become an act of terror. Sailors climbed the conning tower ladder with dread, knowing that somewhere above, beyond the reach of sound or sight, an aircraft might already be watching. The same ritual that had begun every night of every patrol, blowing ballast, opening hatches, breathing deep, now carried the taste of death. The legend of the surfaced wolf was ending. Soon the Atlantic, once ruled by shadows, would belong to the light. And for the men of the U-boat arm, each night that began with the thunder of diesel engines might end with a whisper from the dark, the soft, steady hum of a secret weapon circling in the deep. By the autumn of 1943, the war beneath the Atlantic had become something no sailor of the Great War could have imagined. It was a struggle not of ship against ship, but of machines guided by science, a silent duel between radio waves, magnetic fields, and mathematics. The ocean, once a vast hiding place, had turned into a laboratory of death. In London, the British Admiralty's Western Approaches Command compiled a chart each morning, plotting the known and suspected positions of every German submarine. What had once been red dots scattered across the map now formed a pattern that told a new truth. The U-boats were dying faster than they could be replaced. Each sinking was confirmed by intercepted German radio messages, decrypted at Bletchley Park. The codebreakers who had spent years deciphering Enigma now read Dönitz's signals sometimes within hours. Ultra-intelligence guided Allied patrols to their prey with mathematical precision. Across the ocean, in Washington and Boston, American scientists and engineers worked under a different kind of pressure. The victory of technology over terror was not yet secure. Reports from the Atlantic still told of merchantmen lost, of submarines that slipped away unseen. The U-boats were wounded but not dead. The challenge was to find them faster and kill them before they struck again. The solution came through cooperation between laboratories and factories. Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory, Columbia's Radiation Laboratory, and the Bell telephone engineers pooled discoveries that blurred the line between physics and warfare. One team refined the centimetric radar, extending its range. Another developed improved sonobuoys that could float in the water and transmit underwater sounds by radio to aircraft circling above. Each new invention shortened the time between detection and destruction. While the Allies built instruments, Germany built ghosts. The new Type 9C and Type 7C 41 boats were fitted with stronger hulls, better batteries, and snorkels that allowed them to run diesels while submerged. They were meant to restore the balance. But even these improvements came too late. Allied air patrols, guided by radar and code breaking, could catch a U-boat almost anywhere from Ireland to the Caribbean. At sea, the airmen learned their trade with ruthless efficiency. Pilots who once flew bombing raids over Europe now hunted a different kind of target: a faint phosphorescent wake, a glint of periscope glass, a small grey shadow on the radar scope. In the belly of their aircraft hung the instruments of the new war sonobuoys, depth charges fitted with proximity fuses, and always the secret Mark 24 mine. Each attack followed a grim rhythm: radar contact, visual confirmation, flare or searchlight, the sudden crash of depth charges, or the soft release of a torpedo that left only a ripple on the water. Minutes later, the telltale patch of oil spread across the surface, sometimes mixed with floating debris, cork insulation, timber, pieces of human life rendered anonymous by salt water and fire. To the men who flew those missions, victory was rarely satisfying. They seldom saw the enemy, only evidence that the sea had swallowed him. Lieutenant John Merriman of VB-105 wrote in his logbook, "We attack shapes and shadows. When the oil rises, we know men are dying below, but we feel nothing. It is like killing ghosts." The Germans felt the same invisibility, but as victims. Surviving U-boat crews spoke after the war of their terror at being hunted by unseen forces. "We fought the ocean itself," one sailor told interrogators at Portsmouth. "There was no sound, no light, no enemy we could fire upon. Only the instruments screamed, and then everything ended." Many captains began to mistrust their own gauges, believing Allied scientists had learned to control the very magnetic fields that guided compasses. Inside the headquarters at Lorient, Dönitz read casualty lists that grew longer each week. He was still loyal to the submarine, still believed in its power to starve Britain into submission, but by late 1943 his faith had become an act of denial. When presented with evidence of the new Allied torpedoes, he dismissed it as Anglo-American exaggeration. He told his officers, "There is no weapon without countermeasure," yet none could find a countermeasure fast enough. In the workshops of Kiel, German engineers experimented with bold and Pillenwerfer decoys, canisters that released streams of air bubbles to confuse sonar. They devised coatings for the hulls to absorb radar waves, experimented with rubber skins to muffle propeller noise. Nothing worked for long. The Allies were already 2 steps ahead. For every defensive trick, there was a new radar frequency, a sharper hydrophone, or a faster aircraft. By the start of 1944, the statistics were decisive. The Atlantic, once the graveyard of Allied shipping, had become the graveyard of U-boats. In January alone, 22 were sunk. The loss rate reached 1 in every 4 at sea. Among the men of the submarine arm, the old camaraderie faded into fatalism. Crews joked grimly that each patrol was a lottery of steel. When a boat failed to return, no one asked why. They simply marked its number on the wall and went back to work. Even as the tide turned, the Allied effort continued to expand. Escort carriers' small, hastily built flight decks on merchant hulls filled the gap between air bases. From them flew Avengers and Wildcats fitted with radar and acoustic torpedoes. The Atlantic was now covered by overlapping circles of detection. No U-boat could surface without risk. No signal could be sent without being intercepted. In April 1944, the German submarine U-407 tried to evade an attack southwest of Iceland. It crash-dived, released decoys, and rigged for silent running. The sonar operator heard nothing but the slow beat of his own heart. Then came a faint vibration, distant, steady, alien. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers. Moments later, the explosion tore through the hull. The submarine imploded at 100 meters. The destroyer above logged a single note: "Target destroyed by air-dropped acoustic weapon." Another ghost added to the sea. By mid-year, Dönitz confided to his adjutants that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. "The enemy sees in darkness," he said. "We are blind." What he did not yet know was that blindness would soon be total. New Allied sensors, magnetic anomaly detectors, high-frequency direction finders, and long-range radar would strip the ocean bare. The age of invisible hunters was ending. The war that had begun with periscopes and torpedoes was finishing with equations and oscilloscopes. The U-boats had once symbolized stealth, now they symbolized extinction. Beneath the surface of the Atlantic, the wrecks multiplied silent monuments to a truth that every sailor, scientist, and airman had come to understand. In the invisible war, it was not courage that decided victory, but knowledge. The sea had chosen sides. By the spring of 1944, the North Atlantic had turned from a predator's realm into a graveyard. The German submariners, who once toasted each other as Seawolfer sea-wolves, now whispered of Stahlgräber, steel coffins. They still sailed, still obeyed orders from Admiral Dönitz's command at Kurneval, but few believed they would come home. Each patrol was a wager against mathematics, against radar, sonar, and the unrelenting arithmetic of American industry. The ocean that had once concealed them now betrayed them. The Allies could see in darkness, hear through storms, and strike from the sky without warning. The hunter's craft stealth, patience, surprise had become obsolete. In its place reigned systems, machines, and the seamless coordination of radar operators, cryptographers, and factory workers half a world away. In April of that year, U-404 sailed from Saint-Nazaire under Kapitänleutnant Otto von Bülow. His crew had decorated their boat's conning tower with the painted emblem of a white wolf's head, jaws open, eyes red. They had survived 6 patrols, sunk 15 ships, and believed themselves charmed. Von Bülow was a disciplinarian, a veteran of the early glory days when U-boats prowled the Atlantic like phantoms. Before departure, he told his men, "Our steel protects us, our silence saves us. Remember that, and we will return." But the sea no longer listened to faith. 3 days out, the submarine surfaced in darkness to recharge batteries. They were 200 miles west of Ireland, a place the Allies called the Black Pit, once beyond the range of aircraft. Now it lay beneath the long shadow of an escort carrier group. On the flight deck of the USS Bogue, a TBF Avenger lumbered into the night, carrying a Mark 24 mine under its belly. The radar operator in the rear seat adjusted the scope, and there, among the static, a faint bright curve moved slowly eastward. Contact, bearing 085. The pilot banked, throttled back, and descended into the clouds. Beneath them, von Bülow's lookouts scanned the horizon. They saw nothing, only mist and the thin phosphorescent wake behind their own stern. The sea was calm. They believed themselves alone. Minutes later, the Avenger broke through the cloud deck. Its pilot, Lieutenant Ye. Frederick LeBaron, caught a glimpse of the submarine's hull through moonlight, a black shape slicing the water. The torpedo fell away, its parachute opening like a pale flower against the night. It entered the water with barely a splash. Below, von Bülow felt the thump of the hull as waves slapped harder. He reached for the alarm handle. "Flugzeug! Crash dive!" The deck tilted. Men slid down ladders as hatches slammed shut. Diesel engines roared, then died as the electric motors took over. Depth gauges spun. 10 meters, 20, 40. The submarine steadied at 60. Silence. The crew waited for the familiar pattern of depth charges, the rolling thunder, the storm of concussion. None came. Only the faint hum of machinery, their own breathing, and then a sound like a mosquito trapped in the hull, distant, insistent, growing louder. The sound was not mechanical. It was alive, as if the sea itself were hunting. The helmsman muttered a prayer. Someone shouted, "Ruder hart stewardboard, hard to starboard." The submarine turned. The sound followed. Von Bülow ordered engines stopped, hoping to lose the pursuer. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the explosion tore through the stern. Lights went out. Compartments flooded instantly. U-404 broke in two at 100 meters. The Avenger above reported only a brief oil slick and fragments of cork. All 52 men were lost. Such reports became routine. Each new sinking confirmed the same pattern. No visual detection, no warning, a single explosion. Within the Allied command, analysts at the Anti-Submarine Warfare Evaluation Board compiled data that proved the shift in power. In 1941, each U-boat destroyed had cost the Allies nearly 100 ships lost. By mid-1944, the ratio had reversed. For every submarine destroyed, fewer than 10 merchant vessels were lost, a statistical annihilation. At the U-boat pens in Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, crews no longer celebrated departures with bands and champagne. They slipped out. At night, lights dimmed, watched only by mechanics who knew they would never return. Within the concrete pens, the air smelled of diesel, despair, and resignation. On the walls, chalk marks listed boats overdue. Each name was a grave without a body. Even Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat dream, could see the truth. "The enemy," he wrote in his diary, "has combined science and industry into a single weapon. We cannot match it." He ordered new electro-boats, faster and able to stay submerged indefinitely. But they were still drawings on blueprints, fantasies in a war collapsing toward defeat. The German sailors who still went to sea did so not from faith, but duty. Some joked bitterly that the Americans had found a way to make the ocean itself obey them. Others simply stopped talking. In the control rooms of their boats, they listened to the pulse of the electric motors, aware that somewhere out in the dark, a machine was listening back. By the time the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, the U-boat menace that once terrified the Atlantic convoys had been neutralized. The skies and seas were one continuous sensor, one network of listening, seeing, calculating. What began with a single radar pulse and a secret torpedo over the mid-Atlantic in 1943 had ended the age of the surfaced wolf. And as American and British ships steamed toward Normandy, they did so in confidence, bought not by luck, nor by courage alone, but by the soundless triumph of science. By June of 1944, as the Allied armada surged toward Normandy, the Battle of the Atlantic was already won. The ocean that had once belonged to the Wolfsrudel, the wolf packs, was now dominated by the steady drone of Allied patrol aircraft and the rhythmic hum of convoys moving in perfect order. The sea lanes from New York to Liverpool, once graveyards of burning tankers and broken hulls, flowed like arteries feeding the greatest invasion in history. For Germany's U-boat fleet, the war beneath the waves had become a sentence without reprieve. In the pens at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, men worked under the rumble of Allied bombs. The massive concrete shelters that once symbolized invincibility had become tombs in waiting. Within them, steel coffins were readied for one more voyage, hulls painted, torpedoes loaded, orders signed. Crews smoked in silence. They no longer talked of victory, only of survival. In the mess halls, propaganda posters still hung heroic art of U-boats slicing through blue water, crewmen smiling under banners that read Heimkehr sicher, safe return. But the men beneath those posters knew better. The sea had changed sides. Admiral Dönitz, still commanding from his bunker near Paris, refused to give up the illusion. His radio broadcasts spoke of Wunderwaffen miracle weapons that would reverse the tide. He promised new electro-boats capable of outrunning destroyers underwater. But even he knew the truth. The Allies' command of radar, sonar, and air power had created a cage no submarine could escape. By mid-year, Allied technology had reached a kind of cruel perfection. Every convoy carried escort carriers whose planes flew overlapping patrols. Each aircraft carried centimetric radar that could spot a periscope at 5 miles, and sonobuoys that floated like ears across the surface, relaying sound to the sky above. Destroyers hunted by pattern and algorithm, not instinct. They fired ahead-throwing weapons called hedgehogs, which detonated only upon contact, erasing the telltale plumes that once warned a submarine to evade. And if a U-boat tried to flee deep, acoustic torpedoes waited patient, tireless, and deaf to decoys. In June, U-505, a Type 9 sea-boat commanded by Kapitänleutnant Harold Lang, was caught west of Cape Blanco by the destroyer escort USS Chatelaine and aircraft from the escort carrier Guadalcanal. The Americans attacked with depth, charges and hedgehogs until the submarine, crippled and leaking, was forced to the surface. Instead of finishing it off, the the destroyer launched boarding parties, the first such capture of the war. Within minutes, sailors swarmed across the deck, cutting wires, seizing codebooks, and securing the Enigma machine intact. The event stunned both navies. For the Allies, it was confirmation that technology and coordination had achieved mastery even over secrecy itself. For the Germans, it was humiliation, the wolf dragged to shore, still alive but powerless. The capture of U-505 marked a symbolic end to an era. It revealed, in a single spectacle, what had been happening invisibly for months, the total dominance of Allied intelligence and industrial might. The submarine, once the ultimate predator, was now a specimen, dissected by scientists and sailors alike. Across occupied France, U-boat bases were bombed relentlessly. Tall cranes, half-sunken slips, and shattered workshops lined the harbours. The Atlantic once echoed with the roar of departing flotillas, now it murmured with defeat. Crews returning from failed patrols were met not by bands or medals, but by silence and the quiet clatter of stretchers bearing the wounded. In the journals of German officers, despair bled through official language. Kapitänleutnant Jürgen Osten wrote, "The enemy has turned the ocean into glass. We cannot move without being seen. The water itself betrays us." Another commander compared the new Allied weapons to angels of death that see through the dark. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6th, the U-boat threat was almost irrelevant. The Atlantic convoys arrived unhindered. Troop transports crossed in daylight. Oil, ammunition, and men flowed eastward in quantities that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The great battle that had once determined the fate of Britain had become a logistical exercise. In July, the few surviving U-boats were ordered to operate in the North Sea and along the Norwegian coast, far from the Allied air lanes. But even there, they found no sanctuary. The ley light and centimetric radar gave aircraft night vision. The Mark 24 mine made the deep unsafe, and the code breakers at Bletchley Park read nearly every signal Dönitz sent. The German commander-in-chief of submarines had become a man issuing orders into the void orders that led his men only to death. By autumn, Germany's once proud U-boat fleet was reduced to desperation. Of the 800 boats built since 1939, more than 600 lay at the bottom of the sea. The loss rate approached 75%, the highest of any branch of the German armed forces. In Dönitz's final report to Hitler that year, he wrote one sentence that summarized the truth the Atlantic had taught. "We are fighting not an enemy of flesh, but an enemy of production, science, and time." The tide had turned not just in the ocean, but in history. The Battle of the Atlantic, once fought by courage and instinct, had become the first war of sensors, signals, and machines. The sea, once ruled by darkness, now belonged to those who could illuminate it, and in that new light, the wolves of the deep were gone forever. Winter came early to the North Atlantic in 1944. Gales whipped the sea into mountains of water, and even the mightiest ships vanished between the waves. For the few remaining German U-boats still at sea, the storms brought a small mercy, the weather-confused radar and masked their wakes, but it also made survival almost impossible. Salt water leaked through every gasket, the air inside was damp and sour, and men lived by the rhythm of the bilge pumps, the drip of condensation, and the endless throb of the diesel engines. They were the last wolves' ghosts of a vanished fleet. Kapitänleutnant Ernst Kremser of 482 wrote in his patrol diary, "We no longer fight for victory, we fight to be remembered." His orders were simple: patrol the western approaches, sink whatever could be found, and report no transmissions unless absolutely necessary. But even sending a message was a death sentence. Allied direction-finding stations could triangulate a U-boat's position within minutes. Silence had become their only defense. The ocean, once an ally of concealment, was now an accomplice of the enemy. Each surfacing was a gamble. Every minute above water risked discovery by aircraft equipped with centimetric radar. When Kremser's boat surfaced on the night of the 15th of November, the men worked in near darkness, smoking only under their coats, whispering as if the sea itself might hear. Batteries were recharging. Fresh air flooded through the vents. Somewhere far above, unseen, the mechanical heartbeat of a patrol plane echoed faintly through the wind. At 2300 hours, the radar operator aboard a Royal Air Force Liberator of number 86 squadron caught a faint return. The crew had been in the air for nearly 9 hours, exhausted, half frozen. Then a small green blip pulsed on the scope, a contact at 6 miles. The pilot banked, descended to 500 feet, and signaled his bombardier. The sea was black glass, the target invisible. But technology could see what human eyes could not. Below, U-482's watch officer saw the flash too late, a streak of light from above, followed by the whine of a falling object. "Flieger alarm!" he shouted. Kremser ordered an emergency dive. The boat tilted downward as the diesels cut off. Men tumbled, gauges swung, bulkheads groaned. They reached 70 meters before the explosion came, not a thunderous series of depth charges, but a single, heavy detonation that struck like the hammer of God. The acoustic torpedo struck near the stern. The blast sheared the propeller shafts and ruptured the aft pressure hull. Compartments flooded instantly. Kremser tried to surface, but the engines were dead. The crew fought to close hatches, to reach the forward compartments. Lights flickered, died. The last entry in the log ended at 23:41. The boat imploded within minutes, taking all 50 men with it. The Allies logged the kill without ceremony. Submarine contact destroyed by Mark 24 mine, position confirmed by oil and debris. It was one of hundreds filed that winter. The numbers had become routine, one more victory in a war that had already moved on to the beaches of France and the skies over Germany. Yet, for the men who flew those missions, the sight of oil spreading across the sea never lost its weight. Lieutenant Thomas Greer, a Liberator pilot, wrote home, "We call them targets, but they were men. They die unseen, and the ocean swallows the evidence." By early 1945, only a handful of U-boats remained operational, their commanders no longer expected to survive. They sailed from Norway or Denmark into seas, patrolled by hundreds of Allied aircraft, into waters mapped by sonar and radar. The once proud wolf packs were gone, replaced by single, hunted vessels. Of every 100 submariners who had sailed since 1939, barely 20 were still alive. In February, Dönitz ordered one last desperate measure, Operation Teufelsdieb, the Devil's Thief, a final attempt to strike Allied shipping off Ireland. 7 boats left port, only 1 returned. The others were destroyed by acoustic torpedoes, air patrols, or their own mechanical failures. It was the last coordinated U-boat offensive of the war, and it achieved nothing. When Germany surrendered in May, the surviving crews received the signal they had dreaded and hoped for in equal measure. All U-boats cease operations. Surface and surrender to Allied forces. In harbours from Bergen to Trondheim, grey hulls rose like whales returning from the deep. British and American officers boarded them, disarmed them, and logged their surrender. The German captains saluted, faces drawn, eyes hollow. Many destroyed their Enigma machines before handing over the keys. Pride was the last thing they could keep. Within weeks, dozens of submarines were towed out to sea under Operation Deadlight and scuttled by gunfire. The ocean reclaimed them one by one, steel ghosts vanishing into the depths they once ruled. Thus ended the long night of the U-boat war. The wolves that had once hunted the Atlantic had become prey to the unseen hunters above. Courage had not saved them, nor cunning, nor tradition. Only technology had decided the outcome. The sea, impartial and immense, bore silent witness as the last bubbles of air rose and broke upon its surface, and the war beneath the waves finally fell still. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the message flashed across every surviving German naval frequency in plain language. Der Krieg ist verloren. Cease all offensive operations. Surface immediately and report your position. For the men who read it, there was no confusion. The war was over. After nearly 6 years of hunting and dying beneath the Atlantic, the U-boat arm, once the terror of the seas, had come to its end. At Bergen, Trondheim, and Flensburg, grey shapes began to surface from the mist like ghosts materializing after a nightmare. The submarines that had haunted Allied convoys now moved slowly, their conning towers streaked with rust, their crews gaunt and hollow-eyed. Some raised black flags of surrender, others painted white circles on the sides of their towers to avoid being mistaken for enemies. Allied patrol planes circled above, broadcasting on loudspeakers, "Surface and follow instructions. You will not be harmed." Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Schreiber, commander of U-977, surfaced 200 miles west of Bergen. His men stood on deck in silence as an RAF Liberator passed low overhead. They had been at sea for 42 days and had follow-signed ship sunk nothing. When Schreiber gathered the crew in the control room, he read the surrender order aloud, his voice flat. "We have fought well," he said. "But Germany is finished. The ocean is no longer ours." He did not lower the naval ensign. He simply folded it and placed it in his sea chest. By mid-May, Allied naval task forces began the vast operation to disarm, escort, and process the surrendered submarines. In the harbours of Loch Eriboll in Scotland, Lissahalli in Northern Ireland, and Portland on the English Channel, the spectacle was unlike anything seen before. Row after row of U-boats, nearly 150 in total, lay moored side by side, decks crowded with weary sailors in faded grey uniforms. British destroyers and American destroyer escorts surrounded them like wardens. Journalists watching from the shore wrote that the once deadly fleet looked more like a floating cemetery than a navy. Each submarine was boarded and searched. Weapons were removed, torpedo rooms sealed, Enigma machines confiscated. Allied intelligence officers interrogated the crews, not for vengeance but for knowledge. They wanted every scrap of information about acoustic torpedoes, radar detectors, hull coatings, and new designs rumoured to exist in German shipyards. What they found astonished even the victors. The advanced Type XXI electroboot, capable of remaining submerged for days and travelling faster underwater than on the surface, represented a leap in engineering far beyond anything the Allies possessed. Yet it had arrived too late. Of the handful completed, only 2 ever sailed on patrol, and neither fired a shot. The men who surrendered these marvels did so with the same weary dignity as those from the older boats. They had been promised invincibility. They delivered only wreckage. When Allied officers asked them what had gone wrong, most replied with a single word: Luft. The Allied air power had crushed them. The sky had become a weapon, and the sea could no longer protect them. In the weeks that followed, the Allies faced a new question: what to do with the captured submarines? Britain and the United States selected a few for testing, but most were doomed. Under Operation Deadlight, 116 U-boats were towed into the open Atlantic and scuttled. The work was grim and methodical. British tugs hauled the grey hulks westward, crews planted explosive charges or opened the sea valves, and one by one the boats slipped beneath the waves. Some went down quietly, bow first. Others rolled onto their sides and broke apart. The ocean accepted them without ceremony. The men who watched said it was like watching coffins sink. Not all surrendered. Some commanders, unwilling to live with defeat, chose the old naval tradition, scuttling and suicide. U-873's officers destroyed their ship, and then themselves rather than hand it to the Allies. Others fled, attempting to reach neutral ports in Spain or Argentina. A few succeeded, most did not. For the Allies, the victory was both technical and moral. The long, bitter campaign that had begun with the slaughter of merchant convoys in 1940 had ended in the complete mastery of the seas. The secret weapon from the sky, the radar-guided aircraft and its acoustic torpedo, had proven not only decisive but transformative. It had turned the ocean into a battlefield of machines, a place where human courage mattered less than circuitry and engineering. The lesson was unmistakable. In modern war, the side that mastered science would master survival. By August of 1945, as Japan burned under atomic fire and peace finally reached the Pacific, the Atlantic lay quiet again. The convoys still crossed, now without fear. The wrecks of U-boats littered the seabed from Newfoundland to Norway, steel skeletons in the dark, reminders of a time when men believed they could rule the sea by stealth, alone. The war beneath the waves had ended not with a roar, but with a slow, metallic sigh as the last U-boats slipped beneath the surface. And in that sound, the sound of pressure reclaiming steel, the 20th century's greatest naval transformation was complete. The hunters had surrendered to the sky.